you all for coming here virtually or in person on a rainy Friday in July. I'm Andrea McFeely. I'm here at MITRE. I'm one of the authors of the Coalition Integrated Air and Missile Defense paper that you have a copy to the link at your tables. And I believe a link in the chat. If we could do that, that would be great. Thank you to CSC, the Center for Strategic Competition at MITRE, for hosting this event with MITRE National Security. You guys do an excellent job at this, and we are grateful for your collaboration. Against the backdrop of, this week's NATO summit, where NATO heads of state have agreed to enhance and update NATO's integrated air and missile defense and focusing on increasing readiness, responsiveness, and integration. We are here also with the backdrop against constant airborne threats to Ukraine, continuous missiles, and a variety of small UAS threats from the Houthis in the Middle East, success of the coalition response to Iranian missiles and drones in April, where in each of these cases, no one country can effectively manage the threat. We have to work together to achieve integrated and interoperable capabilities that can face these diverse and global airborne threats. In this paper that we have published this week, we discuss specific ways and recommendations for how allies and partners can more effectively integrate data to create a common air picture, create interoperable C2 and decision-making systems, and collaboratively use modeling and simulation to more efficiently explore gaps and opportunities. We also have a strong focus on how each nation has unique capabilities that should be embraced for their diversity and connected in an agile and federated manner. I think this is going to be one of the themes we discuss today. And today's panel will also explore key challenges within these objectives, such as difficulties in achieving information sharing among partners, the mismatch in costly defeat options against low-cost, high-quantity targets, emerging technologies to allow a coalition to adapt to changing threats, and interoperability in platforms and systems. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panel. They all have very, very long bios, so I cherry-picked a few highlights. So starting with Al Shaffer here, he's the director of the Washington office for MIT Lincoln Labs, former Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, and former director of the NATO Collaboration Support Office in Paris, or just outside Paris. Next, Andrew Michta, director of the Scowcroft Strategy Initiative at the Atlantic Council, former dean at the George Marshall European Center for Strategic Studies, former professor at the U.S. Naval War College, CSIS fellow. Again, picked just a few. Next, Shaikh. He's the deputy director of the Missile Defense Project at CSIS. Ike Harris. He's the vice president of government strategy at Extra, fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Spent 23 years in the Navy, where, among other things, he was a surface warfare officer at the Fifth Fleet in the Gulf. And then our moderator today, thank you, Chris Bassler, Director of Integrated Deterrence here at MITRE, former Chief Strategy Officer at the F-35 Joint Program Office, and former Director in the Office of Naval Research. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. As you've seen, we have an amazing panel today, so really looking forward to the discussion. For those of you that are joining virtually, please, as we go throughout, enter your questions online. We'll be collecting those, and when we get to the Q&A session. So we'll start today with a conversation and some remarks from each of our panelists, and then we'll go into some moderated discussion and then open it up to you all for questions. So, Ike, maybe we'll start with you. Given your operational background, maybe that's a way to set us off for your experiences in the Red Sea and some of the considerations in your long, distinguished career in the Navy.
Thank Chris. Thanks for having us. I was a surface warfare officer for 23 years. My last tour was operational tour was commanding the USS Ramage, which included a deployment to Fifth Fleet AOR. This was give or take our deployment bookended the Soleimani strike. So a lot of the operations we were doing as a BMD destroyer, and the only one in the Gulf at the time, was coalition IAMD, right? And I would say, from an operational perspective, it's really hard, and that was mainly with allies that have mostly the best U.S. kit has to offer, right? Even between, us and the Army and, the integrated air defense picture around the Gulf, there were regular challenges with getting, the, myriad of links to be up and stable for a long period of time, to monitor the situation across a very large area, particularly with the fact that, I think a lot of people think that, when they have this image of the Gulf, sort of thing, 91, where you have, carrier strike groups that are there regularly, destroyers are operating. It's not the case anymore. It's really normally like a 1.5 presence of BMD destroyers. There's LCSs there now. The carrier strike group doesn't really enter the Gulf anymore. It really stays outside for obvious reasons of defensive purposes. So it is a much different picture now. We're much more reliant on land-based systems, which have come a long way since the 91 war, but it is an extraordinarily difficult picture to capture the large geography of the Iranian threat and frankly the myriad of systems they have now, which are both land and sea attack ballistic missiles, as well as the pretty, obviously, as we've seen in a lot of places, the pretty large drone systems they have. And I will just comment to help to throw some compliments to my swole brethren right now. What we've seen in the last 6 to 8 months since the October 7th attacks, the United States Navy right now is regularly defending and defeating a host of fairly sophisticated ballistic missiles that are being launched into the ocean. Drone attacks that are regularly happening, and it's happening so effectively that we don't even hear about it anymore. It's not really a story. When we had the Iranian attack on Israel. Its effectiveness at countering that, the coalition was so good, it sort of belayed the fact that it was really difficult to do that. And I think the challenges we move forward are going to be, as Andrew pointed out in the opening comments, it's going to be a cost threshold, right? I mean, we're spending some really, really good missiles on some fairly low tech that we need these missiles for a lot of different missions right now, not least of which is a potential Pacific conflict in the future. And, we're just not able to make them very fast. And, we're doing some investment right now inside the industrial base, but that is going to be a very, very significant challenge for the U.S. to get spun up on those things. And right now, we're just not on the kaleidoscope to meet the needs.
Well, thanks, Ike. So, Shaan, kind of taking that kind of operational view from Ike, you guys at CSIS and the work you and your team are doing, it's kind of the open source Bible for, kind of a lot of IMD and missile threats and all that. So from the analytical community, what are you guys seeing, and how are you thinking about this increase?
Yeah. So thanks, Chris, for moderating this, and Michta for having this all, and you all for being here. I want to say first that I really enjoyed reading this report, that I thought that this was really fascinating, and not just because Michta invited me, but also because they focused on the nitty-gritty about what is integration, what are the forms of it, how do we promote interoperability, right? When we talk about NATO, integrated air and missile defense, we talk about integration a lot. We talk about cooperation a lot. It's the focus of today's panel. We have heard about it across the river in the NATO summit this week. And that's all good. There's a reason for that. There's a reason why integration and interoperability is so important. There are clear military benefits. There are clear economic benefits. But just briefly, I want to address the fact that integration is not free. Cooperation is not free. That there are some costs to pursuing these activities. For example, sometimes it might slow down procurement of really much needed systems, of these air and missile defense systems that we don't have enough of. Sometimes the politics in Europe and in the United States and elsewhere, it makes cooperation a little bit more difficult. It makes integration of these systems a little bit more difficult. And so over the past week, while I've been thinking about this panel, I've been thinking about, when is integration really necessary or very helpful, and to cover some of the costs associated with it. And in those cases, can we somehow encourage that outside of government for us who are outside, or those who are inside? How do we encourage it? How do we incentivize cooperation? And, at some point, right, we have to take a step back and say, okay, we have reached the minimum threshold necessary for cooperation and for integration. And now we can buy and deploy these systems in mass. And so when have we achieved that level? Right now, I'm speaking pretty abstract, so let me give an example. Right, let's take the European Sky Shield Initiative, ESSI. I'm a big fan of that initiative. I think that is fantastic, because it is a means by which Europe is acquiring these air and missile defense systems that are really necessary. But, would I have preferred if ESSI planners back in 2022 had thought more about integration, had thought more about making sure that these systems are actually compatible with the current NATO air and missile defense architecture? Absolutely. That would have been definitely my preference. I do not know why Germany chose Arrow 3, for example, over, say, THAAD. I don't know why they went with IRIS-T instead of maybe NASAMS or something like that. There are potential political and economic reasons for those choices that were prioritized over the desire for integration. But that being said, like I mentioned, it is still helping Europe to push and actually buy these systems, for which they have not a lot of, and the stuff that they do have is frankly not very good. And so I'm still a fan of that initiative, despite those issues with integration. So in sum, I'm really happy to see the Michta report actually questioning and diving into what are we looking for in terms of integration, in terms of interoperability. And I'm hoping that we also dive a little bit deeper into the nitty-gritty in terms of what are we looking for, what are the costs associated with it, how can we encourage it, how can we promote these activities, and then when do we know that that's enough?
Yeah, those are all great questions, and I think we'll definitely get into that today. So, Andrew, given your significant background, especially in Europe and with a lot of NATO partners, the Eastern Front, a lot of the collaborations and discussion there, and fresh off this week, obviously, with the NATO summit, can you share with us a little bit of your perspective?
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. Really a great honor to be speaking to this group. And we're also partnering with Michta at the Atlantic Council, so I'm delighted to be here. I wish I could be more optimistic about where we are right now. Yesterday, I was listening to Jake Sullivan talk about, providing Ukraine with 5 Patriot batteries, additional systems, and he spoke of hundreds of missiles that Ukraine will get. And I sat there thinking, first of all, how quickly will this happen? And secondly, what was already mentioned here, how long can we sustain shooting millions of dollars of ordnance at $10,000 drones? That is simply not viable, in my view. If you look at the cost of what we expended just defending Israel against the Iranian attack, that's pretty sobering. The most important thing for me is that we're in a race against time when it comes to producing those capabilities. Europe has completely disarmed over the last 30 years. The countries that are arming at speed and scale right now, those are the flank countries. I'm talking about the new NATO members, the Finns and the Swedes, the Poles, the Balts, the Romanians, everybody that's exposed directly to the Russian threat. They get it, they understand. Germany continues to be very heavy on rhetoric, but still needs to do a lot of work to get where it needs to go. The French are pulled both in the direction of the Mediterranean and the Sahel in Africa, and their security optics is not focused as much as it probably should be on what's happening in Eastern Europe. And when I'm in Portugal, I always joke I have no idea what they're talking about. So what I'm trying to say is there's a regionalized security optics in Europe. It depends on where you're on the map that determines whether or not you're all in to actually build capabilities. Right now, 23 of 32 allies are spending at the required minimum, or at least declare that they will, 2%, which is also a political cop-out, by the way, because if you spend 80% of that on personnel retirements, what are you really producing? So we need to start talking to our allies and partners about building real exercise military capabilities. Second point I want to make is we are in a race against time, in my view. You look at the delta between how quickly the Russians are reconstituting their military and how quickly NATO will rearm. That's the risk level for SACEUR and for EUCOM when it comes to executing the regional plans. Last year at Vilnius, everybody signed on to those regional plans. These are binding commitments. So now it's show me the money. Show me that you're actually going to deliver the capabilities that you've promised to deliver. And again, the picture is mixed. I think the administration should use that as a forcing mechanism to go to the allies and say, you need to deliver because you promised to deliver. And without those capabilities, if you look at the requirements for LANDCOM alone, without the Europeans stepping up, we're going to be in a pretty difficult situation. Why do I say that? because we're not against just Russia. We're against an axis of dictatorship. It's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And they've effectively stretched the front, stretching our air and missile defense assets, stretching our naval capabilities from one theater to another. Recall what happened when Hamas attacked Israel. Ukraine disappeared in this town. All the oxygen went out. Think of what's going to happen if there's crisis in the Korean Peninsula or if there's finally, a storm in the Indo-Pacific. We're at 3.1 of our GDP when it comes to defense spending. The authorized force in the NDNA is about 1.3 million. That's the lowest we've been at any time since the end of the Second World War. During the Cold War, we never dropped below 2 million personnel. We were never below 5 to 6% of GDP. During Vietnam at the height, 1967, we're spending 10% of GDP on defense. We had a force of 3.5 million. We have the military that's formatted for one theater, primary theater, and one secondary theater. So without the Europeans rearming, without NATO doing what it needs to do, this is all to me a very highly hypothetical, theoretical exercise. The gaps in air and missile defense in Europe are probably, without going into detail, just as concerning as what you see in Ukraine. So I think this is a very timely report. I think the reason we need to focus on this is that there's always going to be opportunity cost. Think about it. When Finland sends a Patriot battery to Ukraine, that's about 25% of their capacity. This is unsustainable. We need to think of different ways in which we build our systems to make them economical, cost-effective. I was recently in Norfolk talking to a symposium over there. We need to refocus on systems that can shoot down cheap technology of our adversary at an acceptable cost. So not 2 million, missiles, but maybe refocus on energy weapons, make sure there are lasers on every boat, make sure we have the capacity. The Ukrainians are doing a lot of creative stuff as well, using acoustics. And so we need really broad collaboration across the industry, including bringing private equity into the conversation to build up capacity to be able to produce, not like we did for the last 30 years, just-in-time efficiency and all that nonsense. But we need to stockpile, we need to have redundancies in the system. Our logistics will be threatened should it come to war. And to me, this is the most urgent challenge. We're technologically brilliant. We need to now translate that into being able to produce systems at speed and scale that give us the advantage.
Thanks, Andrew. So Andrew really opens the door to a lot of the different experiences that you've had through your very distinguished career. So from the Air Force, your Air Force service and perspective, from your senior leader roles in USDR&E to the technology community that Andrew mentioned, and then of course your roles in A&S on the acquisition side and also in NATO. So share with us a little bit about your perspective, kind of at that from your career at the Nexus.
Sure. First off, I'd like to thank the comments from the other three panelists. I'm changing my opening remarks on the fly, so I don't know how this is going to work. So everything you all said is correct. We need more. I'm going to make this interactive for the people in the room. And online, you can, if you know the answer, just put your hand up. How many folks in here are taxpayers? Okay. To retire current debt in the U.S. only, you all owe me $266,000. Think about that. So we've got to stop thinking of solutions, more money. We've got to lean on NATO to produce more capability. And oh, by the way to help NATO and European nations build capability is not come in and say, buy the U.S. solution. Okay? I've lived in NATO. I've lived in France. They don't want to buy just U.S. stuff. So what does that mean? So you have to think about how are we going to build things differently? Now I'll try the next question. Anybody in here hear of a program called SIAP? Single Integrated Air Picture? You got one. Dale, you've heard of it. So Single Integrated Air Picture, that's about 20-year-old concept. That was to merge Air Force, Navy, Army surveillance systems to create an integrated air picture for any sensor to any shooter. the U.S. failed miserably. And the U.S. failed miserably because we never put in place an architecture. So all the rest of this stuff that you guys are talking about is nice, but if we don't change the fundamental dynamics of how we buy things, creating an open architecture with defined standards and not integration, but interchangeability of systems. Okay? That is what people want, is interchangeability. I can be integrated, I can be interoperable. That means I have to bring my whole kit with me. Interchangeable means you can bring piece parts in and out. So if we have to go to open systems architecture, I believe digitally engineered, so that every nation can contribute what they can into this architecture. Now, this will also include, and I think it has to be done if we're talking about certainly the European theater, a test bed, and it would have to be run by NATO, where each nation can come in and plug in their applications and get them to work together in a test bed. Once you do that, you fundamentally change how we buy things and how each nation can contribute what they can contribute without having to modify their systems and make them like the U.S. or make them like the French systems. But that's a fundamental change in how we operate and how NATO operates. So I believe if we don't use some influence from the U.S. to get the NATO nations to agree to an architecture that they will stand up to and get behind, we're going to continue to have Frankenstein defense systems. You bolt a bunch of stuff together, it doesn't work, and then, we fail. Second thing, munitions. So I've heard a lot about munitions. Okay. Right now, we're shooting $1 million missiles at $10,000 drones.
Insane.
That's nuts.
Insane.
So who is going to step up and generate lower cost munitions? And that is a challenge I think the U.S. should open up to European nations. The last thing I will leave you with, and this is kind of incoherent, but I think it's important. So I have scar tissue from the Romanian Aegis ashore and the Polish Aegis ashore. If you look at the acquisition record of both of those, they were about double time and triple cost of the original estimates. Workforce is not where it needs to be to make all of this stuff work. So part of the whole NATO thing, and there are smart people throughout Europe as there are smart people throughout the U.S., got to make a concerted effort to get the workforce up to the level where they can create not integrated, but interchangeable systems are built around common architectures so that people can come in and plug and play. So I see a lot of folks out here taking notes, presuming taking notes on their phones. Apple is brilliant because they set a common architecture and then anybody could write apps. So why can't you do that for an integrated air and missile defense system? You can, but you got to set the architecture first. And then the Estonians can come in with their software and software systems, because at the end of the day, this is all software driven with a few hard missiles. Let people develop and bring in the applications they can, built around an architecture. So that's a different pathway than I was going to take, but if we don't fundamentally change how we buy systems, we can have all this wonderful talk about 3%, 2%, it fails. So that's my message. And since this is at MITRE, where you guys are good at systems engineering, I think this is a great problem for you all to take on. Help us develop with European nations a very common open architecture and architectural standards for interfaces. That's it.
Yeah, thanks, Al. So maybe we'll start first with a rapid fire question. So we talked a lot about many different aspects that you all highlighted, all very important. When we think specifically about the coalition part of IMD, what do each of you see as the single biggest challenge? I know each of you mentioned, a vast multitude. They're all really important, but for each of you, when it comes to mind, what is the single biggest challenge? Over to you first.
Yeah, so I mean, the way we do, really integrated air defense, you have to have just a ton of really high-end data, right? Because, to hit something with, hit a moving target with another moving target, both of them, many times moving many times faster than the speed of sound, you got to have some really, really good fidelity on the target, and you have to be able to pass that data across a network to a shooter that is available. And that's very challenging, frankly, because not only do you have to have a really good system, but you have to have the security architecture in place that allows for the passing of that very high level, very classified data in some cases across nations' C2 systems. So I think more than anything that as Al pointed out, like you have to be able to get that data from sensor to shooter, and when you're talking about a coalition, it becomes very challenging.
Shaan?
I'll take it again a little bit high level. I think that you've seen even within just this panel the different visions for NATO integrated air and missile defense. I think that is understandable, given how many partners that there are, given how many allies have their own legitimate interests, parochial interests, economic interests. But that's slowing things down. And so, like, you might have a bunch of folks saying, buy American. I don't think that's really going to work. Others might say, okay, we need NATO itself to buy and acquire and deploy these systems on its own and really have this beautiful, seamless data sharing and all of this stuff, right? I think that is fine in theory, but I think in practice it becomes very, very difficult. And so there's various other kind of approaches to this. I liked the sort of idea in the Michta report that we are at a federated approach right now. That is most likely the approach that we will take in the next several years, decades. And so how do we encourage interoperability within that system? That's I think the right approach. But then, as Al had mentioned, right, maybe we do need a new architecture to incorporate everyone's federated air and missile defenses. So so long as we kind of figure out a path forward and put investment there and have leadership pushing the needle in a certain direction, I think that it's just the speed that is the biggest concern for me.
Andrew?
I would see two elements. One is dare to share. Remember, this is a NATO of 32 members with very different geostrategic contexts. So let me leave it at that in terms of how they see their position in the alliance and how they're trying to work to their national advantage in this context. And the second thing is the flip side of Buy American. The flip side of Buy American is buy French, buy German, buy whatever. Remember that the European Commission right now is talking about requiring that by 2030, 50% of all systems and munitions be sourced from Europe, and by 2035, 65%. So there's the flip side of that, where each country wants to protect its defense industry, doesn't want to, go outside of that. And it even leads to such, basic problems like munitions for 155 millimeter howitzers that is supposed to be produced according to STANAGs is actually not cross-compatible when it comes to what's available. This was a conversation I had with a very senior NATO general who was very frustrated that depending on where that munition was sourced, they had issues. And he actually slammed the door and he said, stop defending and protecting your own industries. Think the big picture. Frankly, we're doing the same thing. So changing that to go to your open system argument, which I fully endorse, requires a culture change in terms of how we look at intel sharing, data sharing, coming up with some pathway to get us to share digital capability that we can actually do what he's rightly recommended. And the most important one will be spending the money for that purpose and not just to shore up your own production capacities. Remember, it took President Petr Pavel of the Czech Republic to finally push through the European allies the radical idea of spending euros on munitions sourced from outside of Europe because Europe didn't have capacity. It was for Ukraine. So these are the two major things I see.
Al?
Yeah. So I want to again make this interactive. Anybody know who Admiral Gorshkov was? Very good. Chief of Naval Operations for the Soviet Union for about 28 years, I want to say. Above his desk, he had a wooden banner Now, this was not in English. It was in Cyrillic, and I couldn't begin to pronounce it in Cyrillic. But it said, better is the enemy of good enough. One thing that we fail at in the U.S. and we fail at in NATO is trying to field perfect. If you try to field perfect, it adds requirements, time, cost, all of that stuff. So we have to have field what we can now around an architecture and then be able to layer capabilities in as you go along. That's, I think, the hardest challenge. We don't have that construct right now. So we're stuck in NATO with trying to field perfect. And that's how you get the 30, I know you were at the JSF program office, that's how you get the 35-year development, because we tried to field perfect instead of field what was there and build upon it. So again, if we don't fundamentally change how we think about the problem set, I don't think we get there.
If I have edit to finger,
please.
this is very important. This, good enough, meaning that the warfighter has to have a better system than the adversary, but then there is a scale that you begin to climb. And we've had cases and programs where you load additional requirements onto it, even though they're not fully, implementable at that stage. And I think the last 3 decades, not only reformatted our joint force, because we kind of all of a sudden told everyone no more state-on-state conflict, history has ended, out-of-area operations, and then we lost our mind as a result of the 9/11 and launched the global war on terror and the rest of it, right? And so we fought scheduled wars, as I like to call them, right? So we could say we need so many munitions, so much personnel, so, systems and this and that, controlled every domain. What have we learned from the war in Ukraine? That history has not ended. There are some verities to hard power. You need to have redundancies, and mass matters. And what the Europeans have to understand is that precision will only take you so far. This project we're doing with MITRE, in partnership with the Atlantic Council, is how to leverage technology to offset some of that mass advantage that the Russians are trying to put against us. They're reconstituting about 140 tanks per month, pulling out all systems, T-72s, even T-62s. They produce maybe 10% of new equipment. That'll peak, in my assessment, around 2026. But think about it, it's over 1,200 or whatever that fluctuation may be of tanks a year. Okay? How many tanks do you think the Bundeswehr has? Anybody knows? About 200, half of them are drivable. How many tanks does the British Army have? About 150, again, with a lot of problems. And we could go on and on. So we build exquisite systems that can fly to the moon, make ice cream, and do a latte for you tomorrow like nobody's business. How many do we have? If the Russians drive that armor, if they decide to do that dumb fight, which is what they've always done for 300 years, and move in with that armor, every tank takes a javelin, takes a round, takes a this and that. What happens when you run out of they drive? And it's only 20 miles to Vilnius on the border, less than 200 kilometers to Warsaw. So this is the problem that we have. And a smart company like you guys, I call you geeks, you're systems engineers. They can use technology to offset at least some of that and give us the advantage that we have. But keep in mind, you will not solve the problem. The Army acquired an Air Force mindset when it started shrinking. So it's now all about precision and the rest of it. And we may hit a pebble in the Mongolian desert, from whatever thousands of miles. So what if those tanks are already in Vilnius, in Warsaw, and elsewhere? So I completely endorse this. We need to rethink how we design and acquire our weapon systems.
Al, one thing that you brought up explicitly, but I think everyone else has also discussed, is really this consideration about incentive structures. So when you talk about the open architecture, for those of us also with the acquisition community, SCARs, that's been a long-standing dream, but we see behaviors from primes, behaviors from military service branches, behavior from allies. Where should we start with trying to change that incentive structure? So maybe starting with you and then for anyone else also. But, how can we kind of get after that incentive problem to kind of align the incentives to get to this outcome and not have proprietary open architectures?
So this is going to be a really trite answer. But at the end of the day, it's about leadership and being able to think in terms of life cycle cost. And what I mean by that is, I'll go back. I like telling old war stories. So I was involved in the MRAP program. And initially, the bad guys used detonators, radio frequency detonators. So the first thing they started with were garage door openers. We detonate the IED. We got the detonator, brought it back to Aberdeen Proving Grounds, where they built a system called Warlock. Warlock would jam that particular detonator. They gave a color to it. The first one, I think, was Warlock Brown. We ended up with Warlock Brown, Warlock Orange, Warlock Green, Warlock Red. You couldn't put all of them on a platform. And that was because we didn't have the ability to go interchangeable. It took 3 months to develop a new counter. And so in addition to my open systems, I think you have to think in terms of digital engineering. And then someone's going to have to, show the cost benefit over the life cycle. That's a hint. Mitre, you guys do that very well. So think about the cost differential over the life cycle. And then politically, you could sell it on the Hill, because if you change the way you operate, then you can entice and enhance small business participation. So you spread out the political largesse out of just the big five primes. And if you have the right test bed and the right place for someone to bring in applications, John and Jane Sixpack in Cornstalk, Iowa, if they're good programmers, can develop a capability app, bring it in, see if it works, and you take off with it. So it's about expanding the base politically. And yeah, the primes are going to get hurt. That's life. We need to use every avenue we have in not just the U.S., but U.S. and our allies, and develop those capabilities wherever you have smart folks. Because modern capability, and I agree that it's about mass, but modern capability is also about software. And open up the aperture. And, Lockheed, sorry, you're only going to make $100 billion this year.
I think I've looked at a little bit of where, just in my own kind of research, how Eisenhower brought in sort of a revolutionary shift of, really a World War II army into what began as the Cold War Army and the Army of Precision that followed. And there was national level leadership of the president and a SecDef that came in, Charles Wilson, that was from a car company, right? And had no duty experience other than fighting in the war. And it was with that level of, interest from the national level that made it possible for Eisenhower and his, and his subordinates to remake the culture of DoD and to really create a generational shift for the Cold War. And I mean, frankly, other than, very tactical operational level, the military organization hasn't been part of the national level conversation since, maybe the end of the Cold War. And I think to the points that you're making, right? I mean, we're talking about incentive structures, but that really is, how is the bureaucracy organized in a way to produce things that are, cheaper and better and in more mass? And at the moment, everything is set up to do the other thing, right? Congress, we have our own sort of constituencies inside individual districts around primes. That kind of handcuffs what you can really do inside the services. When you talk about radical change, we're not going to stop building carriers despite all of the evidence that says the carriers are extremely vulnerable, because there's a huge congressional constituency that goes into carrier construction. So in my mind, I mean, it is sort of like, you can't just throw up your hands, but it really has to be, this has to be understood from the bully pulpit of the president to say, we are at a generational shift in military structure, and it has to come down from that level to say, the entire system has to be reformed in a way that makes us more agile. And it's likely it can't come from the bottom up.
So for those of you who are out virtually as well as in person, please get your questions ready. We'll do one more question, but then I'll open it up to the audience. So we spent a lot of time talking about NATO. We spent a little bit of time talking about CENTCOM and lamenting some of the challenges, especially in Europe and NATO and the fight in Ukraine and all that. We have seen, especially coalition sharing capabilities, I think in a very rapid and ad hoc way, actually turn out fairly well in the Middle East, bringing in many partners who generally did not work together. So from each of you, kind of, what were some of the lessons from that out of CENTCOM, for the Saudis, the Israelis, others, again, who don't typically work together, that you kind of surprised you? What lessons should we take to the NATO context? And then perhaps another area that we haven't really covered very much today is kind of the Indo-Pacific element. So, those allies, Japan, Korea, Australia, and so on.
Yeah, I can start this. So first, I want to preface with this is, an incredibly impressive demonstration of air and missile defense along a coalition that was kind of brought together seemingly ad hoc, as you had said, Chris. But it is one instance. It was one day, and so I am cautious about bringing deriving too many lessons from that episode. That being said, I think it's fascinating to see. Okay, if you do have aircraft that probably had a decent common operating air picture, you have enough time to set up a coordination body, which the U.S. did, fortunately, and you have the communication networks. You have systems that are relatively interoperable because they were primarily U.S. and Israeli systems, which we've seen being used in various exercises and drills before. So I think that it was very impressive. And now looking at Europe, on the other hand, you have a much larger base of territory that you're now defending, right? And so that will have just the problem of geographies. You have a variety of systems now. It's not just U.S. and Israeli. You're talking about SAMP-T, IRIS-T, THAAD, Patriot. You're combining all this stuff, aircraft that are not necessarily American as well. So it complicates that a lot. And I think we could do fairly well in the ad hoc. We can still do still support that kind of coordination. I just think it might take a little bit more time potentially. Looking at Indo-PACOM now, looking at Asia, that's to me even more worrying because you don't have that muscle memory for this stuff. You don't have a sort of NATO integration kind of thing. You don't have the institutions that are related to air and missile defense. We have been conducting a ton of these air and missile defense, exercises with partners, Australia, Japan, South Korea, others. But it's still, in my mind, still a question as to how quickly we could ensure that we have that coalition, ensure that we have proper data sharing agreements there.
So I would take a slightly different tack at this. I agree with what you said, but I'm speaking to engineers, so don't stone me, okay? After I say what I'm going to say. I think we're down the rabbit hole when it comes to warfare, of thinking predominantly technology, counting units, capabilities. There is a temporal dimension to warfare. There is a geographic dimension to warfare. One of the reasons why I think we got so wrong, at least a lot of our analysts, the initial phase of the war in Ukraine, the assumptions were that Ukraine would be defeated quickly and then would revert to some sort of a different type of warfare, is because we were focusing predominantly on numbers and capabilities per se, kind of technical aspects. I think cooperation and interoperability is also a function of the kind of regional balances and the environment in which a country lives. When I was teaching at the Naval War College, I would always tell my captains, nations live in neighborhoods, right? And what that neighborhood looks like, what is the risk and threat defines your security optics. We happen to be a global power, so we look at it in global terms. But if you're looking at regional balances which are at risk of unraveling, there is an opportunity here to leverage that sense of insecurity, depending on where the threat is coming from, in addition to the technical aspect, to build alliances, at that regional and sub-regional level that would then foster cooperation. So this is not just a technical problem. I think it's predominantly a political problem to get people on our side, especially our planners, to understand that if they don't fully embed themselves in the history and culture of the region and understand what the drivers are, they will miss tremendous opportunities when it comes to building these coalitions. And then technology can come in and tie it all together.
Chris, I know that we want to get the questions, but I'm going to give you a different type of answer.
Sure.
So you ask, what lessons can we learn? I don't think we can learn any lessons. The Gulf War was so much different. We had an adversary who couldn't fight. didn't have air power, and we had all these people we built into the coalition who we had sold U.S. stuff. I mean, Saudi Arabia bought only U.S. stuff. All these rich Middle Eastern countries bought U.S. stuff because they didn't have a defense industrial base. So interoperating wasn't that big a deal. So I worry that we're going to learn the wrong lesson. That's number one. Number two, we had very defined objectives for Gulf War I, and we forgot that. And what were our objectives as Afghanistan dragged along? So somewhere along the line, we forgot the Powell Doctrine. And I worry that if we try to approach this as only an engineering problem without thinking about objectives and what you're trying to achieve, we will fail.
This is very important, especially in light of the summit that we had. I still walked away not knowing what the strategy is for the end game. You know, we keep talking about strategic competition, great power competition, rules-based international order. This is all normative. What is the geostrategic map we're trying to get to in Ukraine, right? What's the end game? And unfortunately, I don't hear that. So this is critical because you cannot build anything that will work if you don't have a strategic picture clearly in view, for as long as it takes.
So don't lose is not going to cut it.
Yeah.
I'll just say quickly, so kind of to Al's point, don't let perfect be the enemy of good enough. You know, I'll steal a quote from Mark Montgomery that, there's 3 levels of coordination. There's deconfliction, you go left, I go right. That's it. There's coordination where, we both are the same way, but we're still doing our own thing. And there's integration. I would say, there's a few places where we get close to integration in the U.S. system, between services. But I think maybe the one lesson learned from the Middle East you mentioned is, maybe deconfliction is good enough in some places. Like, we don't necessarily have to get to, information real-time sharing on every ally. We can just say, hey, look, you're going to cover this. That's your bubble. That's you. We're not going to mess with that. No blue force are going in. Anything that goes in there, that's on you to take out. And that just may be where we get to with the realities of all of the things we talked about.
Or at least start there.
Right.
Just really quick on that.
Yeah, please.
That's a great point. It's like, does every sensor really need to connect to every sensor? Or if we're talking about counter UAS, for example, this is small stuff that you're looking at. I don't expect a counter UAS system in Finland to be communicating with something in like Spain, right? We should really, the phrasing that we say, every sensor, every shooter, connected, integrated, mesh network, beautiful. I think that's probably fine in strategy documents. That's to be expected. People like saying it. But in reality, when we're actually looking at what's talking with each other, we should just remember, like, hey, there are instances in which, countries do not necessarily have to be talking, maybe communicating generally, but does that information need to be sent down specifically in terms of coordinates, in terms of, queuing data? I don't think so.
All right, we'll open it up here in the room to questions. So please raise your hand if you have a couple questions. We'll start here, and then we'll go there.
Good morning. Thank you so much. Mr. Dinas Butners here at MITRE. Team, thank you for your remarks and your time on this wonderful Friday. Al, I do have to say thank you for triggering me with the emotional scar tissue of Reżakowo and the shore program in Poland. We can get offline and, maybe share some emotional trauma on that one.
Or a beer.
Or several at that point. But you did bring up a very good key catchphrase, test beds. And right now, with regards to IAMD, Ukraine is the world's largest test bed for IAMD, and the war grinds on. As much as we're trying to figure out what is our actual strategic direction here at NATO, here in Washington, D.C., Kyiv is still fighting a war. Ukraine is still trying to integrate and interoperate their systems along with all the Western donated material. So my question for all the panelists, maybe just to recap for today's event, looking ahead, what will it take for the next 3 years for Ukraine to have a sustainable IAMD network capable of countering the Russian missile threat? Thank you.
So the easy question is
easy. Yeah, bullets. Easy. They need munitions. They're running out of munitions right now. Their shot doctrine is way lower than it had been, and we don't have enough munitions flowing into Ukraine for them to defend themselves. For me, it's a very simple answer.
For me, the biggest question is how much time does Ukraine really have? It's not a technical problem.
No.
And I'm not just thinking, I agree about the number of missiles they have. The Ukrainians are running out of people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in 1991, when it became independent, it was 52 million. When the Russians invaded for the second time, this is a 10-year war. This didn't start in 2022. They were under 40 million. Right now, by my calculus, there's somewhere between 25 and 30 million people left in Ukraine. The average, before Zelensky lowered the draft age to 25, the average age of a Ukrainian soldier was 43. Okay. The cohort of 18 to 20, which will have to be mobilized, is, I think, the smallest they've ever had since the Second World War. So the reason I've asked about what is the strategic outcome, and I find it really odd that we still talk as long as it takes, which you're a military guy. I mean, show me a planner who would come into a commanding officer and say, I've got a war for you for as long as it takes. I think you would just throw him out the door and say, your career has just ended. Have a nice day, right? So this is what worries me the most. Every nation has a breaking point. Ukraine is bleeding. This is not just an engineering problem.
Right.
This is a problem of every society having a breaking point. And at this stage, when you go into Ukraine and see now billboards that are urging you to join the military, that's a sea change. The first army that was created, that went to fight, that ran out of juice because we didn't give them what we should have given them for that first offensive. That was the most highly motivated, all volunteer force, the best, the smartest they've had. So engineering problem will be with us, but we have to embed this in the larger geostrategic picture and think realistically of what we need to do if there is a chance that they can actually break the Russians strategically on the battlefield.
Take your next question over here.
Good morning. My name is Marcus Weiler. I'm from MITRE, not an engineer, a lawyer. So I have a question about what is the galvanizing event that will create the political will in the United States and across Europe to embrace what you all are talking about. To me, it's self-evident that you're right, but I don't see that political will has translated. You feel are you voices sort of just lonely voices out in the desert? What galvanizing event will it take, as you said, tanks in Vilnius, Russian tanks in Warsaw, before people understand what you're talking about?
Is it to me?
Maybe you will start. Yeah.
Okay, so shameless commercial plug. On the day of the summit, I published a piece in Politico. If you Google me, you can find it, where I argue that while we have, our economies are orders of magnitude bigger than anything you can imagine Russia, China, and the rest of them can put together. Some people dispute this, saying in PPP, it's really not that way. No. We have the resources. The combined defense budgets of the NATO allies are 10 times of what the Russians have currently, even with their surge of 60%. What we lack is leadership. I mean, I said to a European colleague, he got offended. I said, spent 7 years in Germany, came back about nine months ago. So you've been rolling in butter for 30 years, made out like bandits. German unification, pent-up demand in Central Europe, acquisition of assets, globalization, subcomponents and markets in China. Well, fat times produce managers for the most part. They don't produce really leaders, right? And so I think unless we get our leaders to speak directly to our citizens about how dangerous the situation is, it will take indeed a Pearl Harbor-like shock to the system. And I hope and pray we don't get to that. So every place I go, I run like a man with hair on fire. I haven't made very many friends in this town since I've been back because I'm telling them things they don't want to hear. They don't want to hear that, in fact, you don't do strategy by just saying, we got to manage escalation. And you first ask what your irreducible interests are. Our prosperity, our security depends on ensuring that the current kind of pressure on those different regional theaters does not implode into an all-out conflict. World War II didn't start because the Soviets and the Germans invaded Poland. It started with Manchuria, Czechoslovakia, and things began to unravel at the regional level, that's when all hell breaks loose. Unfortunately, I don't think Mr. Scholz is a stellar leader to tell the German people, or Mr. Macron, or quite frankly, I talk to people on the flank, they get it. I mean, Finns get it.
Oh, yeah.
There's a saying in Finnish that I love. You can fry a Russian in butter, but he's still a Russian and tastes the same. That's what a soldier told me when he was driving me to the airport. I thought they get it. They understand what the threat is.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that, to your point, how many Sputnik movements have we had in the last 10 years, right? There was the hypersonic missile. There was the operations around Taiwan after the election. It happened after the inauguration. Ukraine, all this stuff. So, I mean, to your point, I've seen many articles around many specific instances. This is the moment when the balloon flies over the United States that we're all going to wake up and realize what kind of threat we're in. And I mean, a lot of credit to the Biden administration for doing some stuff and some great work to keep Kiev alive. But the one thing they're not doing, I think, is this sort of, we're in strategic competition. We're in a Cold War, right? The Chinese, everything they're doing, the point about the sort of axis of dictatorships now. I mean, any metric you could use to say, are we or are we not in a Cold War? It is overwhelmingly that we are. And the fact that we're unwilling to say it because we don't want to upset the Chinese for our business interest is sort of insane. And until we're ready to just call a spade and really, start from the top down and say, hey, look, this is an existential threat to democracy versus two systems that are incompatible with one another. And that's it. So we all got to get behind that philosophy. We're not there yet.
Ike, you're making the presumption that Americans want democracy.
No, that's a. Do we have enough time for that?
That'll be the next panel. But
all right. So my name's Sam Spencer. I'm an engineer here at MITRE, and I noticed kind of a recurring theme in a lot of the things you've been talking about. How much time does Ukraine have? How many people do they have? How do we sustain shooting at cheap UAVs with expensive missiles? To an outsider, I would say I know a lot of people who've taken the view that it seems like we've given Ukraine just enough help to keep the war going. Sure. Is there a difference? And so I think that's sort of an obvious application of this idea. In Israel, we look at the situation, we say, what's the goal, or what is a reasonable goal there? Is it just to push Hamas back, or can they eradicate them? Is there a difference between fighting not to lose and fighting to win? Just saying, can we structure our forces so that we can keep fighting, or can we structure forces so that at some point we don't have to fight, that we can end the fight? Because I think, if you're trying to sell the idea that we have to make this much investment just to be able to keep doing whatever we're doing, that's probably a harder sell to somebody than to say you can actually achieve some sort of victory. So, as I said, that applies across a lot of different contexts. But I guess the way that I would frame it is, when you're structuring your investments and your strategies and so forth, is there a difference between setting up just to be able to sustain the fight or setting it up to win?
So said another way, do we need to bring back the high-low mix? Any comments on that, Shaan?
Yeah. I think I'll focus on the Ukraine example because I think that ties also to your question earlier about what do you need to really support Ukraine in terms of air and missile defense as well. And it's not even a question at that point about air and missile defense. Obviously, more capacity, fantastic. I keep talking about capacity. But at this point, it is also a question of risk tolerance, which goes to your point, right? Is how willing are you to accept risk of certain escalation, of certain, allies being worried about where this conflict is going, U.S. allies who may not share the same kind of risk tolerance. So one of the things I'm thinking about is that Ukraine just can't play catch all the time, right? Is that air and missile defense is not a game of catch. You're not supposed to just be taking in drones and missiles and ballistics and aircraft constantly and just defending yourself. There needs to be some integration of offensive strikes, defensive fires. And we have seen the Biden administration allowing Ukraine to go forth and strike targets that were not on the safe to strike list before. So we are seeing steadily, and some folks will reasonably say very, very steadily, we are seeing some movement towards greater risk tolerance. But I think it's a really tough question as to how much is enough. I don't want to sit down and say, like, go forth, guns a-blazing, send in American troops, send in whatever, and Russia won't respond negatively. So there's some middle ground. I don't know what that is. Perhaps we need a rebalance in our portfolio there.
What is the U.S. strategic objective in the Ukraine?
Not to lose.
So I would, if you want to kind of see my point on this, can anybody explain to me what it means Russia can't win, Ukraine can't lose? What does that mean as a strategic objective? How do I operationalize this, right? Number one. Number two, I think there's a larger problem of the last 3 decades because we have developed, in effect, a zero-risk society when it comes to expectations. And we need a real culture change in the sense that we need our leadership to speak directly to the fact that the society has to live with risk, has to not fear failing. And if it fails, takes this as a lesson to try again and succeed, right? So if escalation management is your entire objective, then you're going to consistently lose at every stage. And quite frankly, if you look at what's happening since 1945, right, and especially post-Cold War, we broke a lot of stuff. We have no problem destroying, whatever adversary we had. Have we achieved strategic objectives? And my answer would be no. Maybe in Grenada, but I would have to talk to them, right? So the problem is the strategic culture that we have developed, where we believe that you can commit troops, go into a war, send equipment, and somehow not have skin in the game. And I think a large part of that is because we're now, and all of Europe as well for that matter, except for the Finns and, the Lithuanians are now going back to conscription. We have all volunteer professional military, right? And we have a culture of security consumers. Our citizens do not think themselves responsible for national defense. There's no skin in the game. And quite frankly, I wrote a piece calling for the return to national military service in the U.S. You should see the amount of hate I got on social media. But then the gentleman who is the acting director of Selective Service reached out to me and he said, can I come to your office and talk? Because this is the problem. And what triggered me to write that piece was I was having dinner with some folk here in Washington. One of them said, I pay my taxes. We have an all-volunteer military. Why should I be concerned? I said, so you look at the military and the irreducible national security function of the state, like a security guard at the mall, right? I said, oh, it's not really. No, that's the attitude we've developed. So we've given the Ukrainians an IV drip of A. But if we don't change our approach, if you go to war, it's not as long as it takes. It's whatever you need to break the adversary as quickly as possible, render him combat ineffective, and then to be able to set your terms and achieve your political objectives. That's what we use the military for. But unfortunately, we forgot that.
Well, I think you all have given us a lot of food for thought. Really appreciate a lot of great discussion, great questions from the audience. Just also as a reminder for those who have not yet had a chance to take a look at the new MITRE report and the new MITRE publication on coalition air and missile defense, please visit our website. It's also posted with this event link. And if you all will join me in really thanking our panelists today, really appreciate all of you coming to remarks.
Thanks.
And we look forward to seeing everyone at the next one.
Thank you.